Listening to GWP News Weekly. I'm your host, Isaac Hedges. In our top stories tonight, we'll be looking at some protests that took place over the weekend, recent evacuation, and what's next for the Artemis II mission. All that and much more coming your way on GWP News Weekly. So, Jake, as you've likely heard, as many of the folks at home have likely heard as well, we saw a recent string of protests again this past weekend of a similar nature to what we've seen in the past year. Again, something so prevalent, we've even done an episode about it here on the podcast, almost an entire episode dedicated to it. So, what about the ones that happened this past weekend? What do we know about them, Jake?
Well, we know that they were all across the nation, across many different cities, including even in Nevada and Joplin. There was a few protests that took place, but we do know that the central protest, if you want to call it, or where the speeches were happening, that was in St. Paul, Minnesota. So that's where the big protest that had just thousands and thousands and thousands of people there. But there were still several hundred that turned out at some of the protests around here across the state of Missouri. We had about 2,500 people around the Boone County area here that turned out in Columbia, and then there was a couple hundred in Joplin, and then there was even some people there at Nevada as well at the Austin and Ash Street corner there at that park.
Absolutely, Jake. Yes. A recent development, of course, over this past weekend. And as you mentioned, these were going on all across the country in all 50 states. And again, these are, if you're not familiar, of course, the No Kings protests that we are referring to. Did an entire episode where we sort of break down the claims of the organization that organizes these protests, sort of what they're for and what they allege, and sort of analyze that alongside an article. Now, again, the gist of it is, and many of the folks at home have likely heard, Jake, and you can certainly chime in on this, but my understanding is what these people allege is that our president, President Trump, for some reason resembles a king. Not sure exactly what gave them that idea. Jake, do you know any more about it?
Yeah, so it has to do with the concern that the president in power right now is potentially abusing the presidential power. And so that seems to be some of the concern with some of the recent things, like the war in Iran, of course, that has been on the top of the list, as well as the shutdown. Some blame the president for being responsible for the shutdown. And then other concerns included the Epstein files release as well. And so those were among some of the reasons why the group is claiming that the president resembles a king.
Yes, interesting information there. So, again, something, Jake, think that is a bit telling about this whole situation. Now, sort of what's implied, again, when they call these protests no kings, again, as you mentioned, they allege that President Trump is acting like a king. Though, interestingly, over the weekend, we saw actually one of the supporters of the No Kings protest with a major post online and sort of made a point. Again, they said no kings. They said President Trump never has been and never will be a king. And well, to me, Jake, this wasn't terribly shocking, but again, to some, this may be quite the stunning admission. And again, we analyzed this whole thing in depth in our previous episode of the Great World podcast, alongside another great article. Again, we look at the perspective of one who actually truly would support a king or a monarchy. Again, a different form of government from what we're accustomed to here in the United States. But again, it is still one that's used. It's been used at different times throughout history. And so there are legitimate supporters of it. And so we analyze this alongside the article, Are You a Monarchist? Again, a great episode. If you didn't catch it, it's always available on the Great World Productions YouTube channel. You can go back and check it out. But as we mentioned over the weekend, these were going on all across the country. And again, my question, Jake, is, and maybe you have more information on this, when these are happening across the country, I guess ultimately what they're hoping to do is influence public policy, presumably what a lot of these protests aim to do. But again, many of these areas, in terms of what exactly, or what specifically they hope to accomplish, and this was kind of one of our points in the past episode that we did. And this still seems to be a common theme with these protests as to what exactly is going on. There seems to be some tension again across different cities and states that are recognizing these protests as to what exactly they're arguing for. I, for one, will admit that I don't fully understand it. Jake?
Yes, well, again, as we've kind of already covered today on this news segment, is that there's concerns that Trump is potentially abusing his power of the president. But what's very interesting is that, of course, um, here in the United States, the founding principles of the Constitution was that there would be no monarch, there would be no king in charge. And if you look at it from a technical standpoint, we don't actually have a king. And, most of the times in the past when people have protested against having a king, you think of when you hear the phrase no kings, that people would be protesting for that because there is a king and they don't want there to be a king anymore. But the fact is that there actually isn't a king. But the claim is not necessarily, people aren't saying that Trump is a king. They're saying that he's acting as if he would be a king because he's abusing those presidential powers. And so that's some of the concern that we have. Of course, I believe one of the big concerns also relates to ICE, which, of course, is one of the core disagreements, you could say, with the Department of Homeland Security shutdown, is the fact that the Democrats were wanting to not necessarily fund ICE and Border Patrol, which kind of go hand in hand. Border Patrol and ICE, obviously they are very distinct, but they do kind of work in line with each other, if you want to look at it that way. And so both of those would not be funded by their plan. And really their concern is some of the protesters were holding up signs that said abolish ICE. And so this seems to be from some of the pushback from Trump's, you could say, his efforts to speed up and intensify ICE operations around the nation. What would your take be on that, Isaac?
Oh, well, yes, that's an interesting point, and I suppose a sub point, of course, that relating to the ongoing government shutdown, which we covered previously, that, of course, primarily affects the Department of Homeland Security. It affects Immigration and Customs Enforcement and CBP, of course, Border Patrol. So, again, related organizations. There's been a lot of tension between parties that is on that matter. But again, so perhaps that is a subset, again, in the position of a lot of those protesters. But again, in terms of what they're truly looking at, again, sort of mainly what they allege, what is implied in the name. And again, sort of if you do more of an analysis on this, like we did in our episode where we focus more on these No Kings protests, again, if you kind of look at their mission statement, well, that is what they allege. They suggest that President Trump has abused his power to the point of resembling king. So again, the fact sort of is that again, President Trump has done a number of different things by executive order. Now, again, there are folks on both sides, and particularly the opposing party, that again object to this. But this isn't something unique to President Trump. Again, there are many presidents of years past that have accomplished things by executive order. Now, you mentioned specifically the war going on in the Middle East, the war going on in Iran right now, and again some lack of support that there may be across the country for that. And again, that's something that we've often seen again across different presidencies, different foreign wars that we've been involved in. And one thing that you find, of course, with military operations, the president, of course, being commander in chief of the U.S. military, well, it's sometimes easier for a president to accomplish things overseas in foreign wars as commander in chief of the U.S. military than it actually is for them to accomplish legislation here at home when they have to work through Congress. And right now, we're seeing a bit of a standstill in Congress, of course, with the government shutdown. We're trying to reach a resolution. And so we're not seeing a lot going on at home in Congress. And so that's a big part, I'd say, Jake, of why we're seeing more of a focus at this point on, again, what's going on abroad, what's going on in the Middle East in particular with the war in Iran at this point. Does that answer your question at all?
Yeah, I would say it certainly does. And I think kind of continuing on the subject of the government shutdown, again, it's now the longest government shutdown in U.S. history, as we have now passed the previous longest government shutdown, which of course was the shutdown last fall that we covered as well. And so that is something to keep in mind, is that it's actually even longer than last year's shutdown. Now, one of the problems with that is that we know that this shutdown is probably going to continue for at least another 2 weeks, as both houses of Congress are in recess until April 13th for the Easter holiday and Passover. So that, of course, is going to extend the shutdown likely for at least 2 more weeks, if not even longer than that. Of course, there was a bill that was passed through the House, but the Senate has to meet, and the Senate does not meet until April 13th. So again, we know that that is going to cause a delay in the, um, I guess you could say, movement to resolve that conflict.
Absolutely, yes. Some important information there, Jake. As you mentioned, Congress now, of course, on Easter recess, and so that'll sort of draw out the government shutdown that is going on now, and again, already longer than the previous government shutdown that we covered. Now, an important distinction, one that we make repeatedly, but an important one nonetheless. So, again, we will continue to. This is different from the previous government shutdown we saw in that this is a partial government shutdown. Again, the focus on this is the Department of Homeland Security and its agencies. So, again, that is not to take away from it in any sense. But again, now overall, we're looking at the longest government shutdown in our nation's history. So, again, a serious thing. And we're not seeing a lot accomplished right now. Of course, there's not a lot that they can do because they're on Easter recess. They're not doing anything right now. But again, before that, there seemed to be a fair bit of foot dragging that is, between the two houses of Congress. And again, the parties, and not a whole lot of agreement on actually reaching a resolution on getting to the bottom of this. So, not a lot of answers at this point as to when exactly this thing will come to an end, when things will be restored. And we can certainly speculate about it, about how close they are. But again, we haven't seen a lot of signs from where I stand. Jake?
Yeah, certainly not. Of course, with the different houses continuing to be in disagreement with should the entire Homeland Security be funded or should only certain departments within that be funded. Of course, that seems to be one of the bigger conflicts with that. And of course, that relates back to the No Kings protest, because that is one of the main arguments for why they're protesting this. This group is concerned about funding ICE. And so, of course, with the people who had the signs that said abolish ICE, that directly relates to them. And so I guess that would kind of answer the question that I heard from some people as to why, if the majority of the reason for the No Kings protest is for the war in Iran, why not protest the war in Iran? I got that question over the weekend from several different individuals. And my best guess that I have, just kind of based on the information that we know from the protesters themselves and what they had to say, is their concern is a lot bigger than just the war in Iran. It also has to do with the partial government shutdown, as we mentioned, the Epstein files as well, and then just various other uses where they feel like that the president has overstepped his power as the president of the United States. And so that seems to be the idea, or at least why this movement began for the No Kings protests. The idea is that the group is protesting that President Trump has abused his power, and that resembles almost like a king. And so they feel like that President Trump has turned into a king. As far as when would we consider President Trump to be an actual king? Do we think that he actually is one? I would say that there's not really any evidence that suggests that, at least formally, at this point in time. Of course, some people have concerns that he will try to run for a third term and will be reelected in the presidential election in 2028. But at this point in time, the president doesn't really seem to have any intentions on doing so. So, as far as would we consider him a king if he were to win a third term? Well, I would say at that point, obviously, that would become a problem. But the fact is that he isn't on his third term. He's on his second term and doesn't seem to be interested in a third. So that is very important to note about that.
Absolutely, and there's a whole other question around that, Jake. Certainly, previous presidents have campaigned on this issue, on the issue of term limits, on exactly how that ought to be. And now, again, opponents to this would argue that we already sort of have a natural term limit, which is the election. Again, if we don't feel that this candidate is qualified anymore, then they won't be elected. So, again, just sort of another angle of that. And again, we look at this thing. It's very easy to sort of just apply things and look at things from the perspective again of our relatively short lifetimes. Again, how exactly we've known things to be, and for a while now, most of our lifetimes, we've had presidential term limits as such, but that hasn't always been the case. And for a good part of our country's history, that wasn't necessarily the case. So again, along the course of our nation's history, we've had a number of issues regarding that. But again, in terms of the term limits as they are today, they're relatively modern in the grand scheme of things as we sort of open up to a broader scope, again, as we approach our nation's 250th birthday. Jake?
Yes, but that modern limit on the number of terms is active. And so if a president were to try to serve a third term, then that would definitely be a violation of the Constitution.
Well, yes, that's a good point, Jake. Yes, but the laws currently in place, again, that wouldn't go anywhere, right? Again, you say serve another term. Well, one simply doesn't serve. One has to be elected by serving another term, and one can't practically be in an election at this point for president of the United States. Again, they've already served a couple of terms. They can't run again. So, in terms of serving another term, I'd say that's out of the question. Again, that wouldn't be legally allowed at this point in terms of what practically would happen, if that helps to clarify things at all.
Yes, but that is a very important note that throughout the 250 years, that term limit has not existed the entire time. Of course, we had President Franklin D. Roosevelt that served over three terms. So that's an important, just kind of side note that the term limit hasn't always existed. So it's not really one of the founding principles, but it is certainly something that is is currently a law.
Absolutely, Jake. And of course, it's interesting that you mentioned that, of course, about FDR. In the case of our grandparents, many of them, again, for much of their lives, FDR would have been president. So again, it wasn't that long ago that we saw a different thing. And again, we've seen, of course, FDR was a Democratic president who served for a very long time. And we've seen, again, more recently, presidents, of course, Reagan campaigned on this. Again, he was against term limits. So, again, some interesting points on that. Though, again, we've had that policy in place for a fair while now. Again, certainly all of my lifetime. There's been some question around it, Jake.
Yes, and of course, that was the 22nd Amendment in the U.S. Constitution that does limit a person to two elected terms as president. That was ratified on February 27th, 1951, and it's very clear. It states that no person shall be elected to the office of the president more than twice. And so, something interesting to note about this is it's very important to understand that if a president were to take over in the middle of another presidential term, it would then come down to at what point. If it was in the second half of the term, like if it was more than 2 years into the term, that would not count as an entire term. But if it's less than 2 years into it, then that means that he or she would have served for more than 2 years for that term. And so then that does count as one of their two terms.
Absolutely, Jake. Yes, an important distinction to make on that. And again, we've seen issues like that in the past in our country's history, where again a president has passed away in office, or again has been deemed um, unfit or otherwise incapacitated to hold office. And again, where we would follow the chain of succession there, of course, vice president being the second in command, the Speaker of the House being third in command. So again, important in the scenario that that happens again, where a president, for whatever reason, dies in office or is otherwise incapacitated, that there is someone to take the reins.
Yes, and it would seem that many from the No Kings group would hope that for whatever reason that the president may be removed from office. So if that were to occur during President Trump's term, then the current Vice President J.D. Vance, as you mentioned, would be next line in succession for the presidential position. So
Absolutely, yes, Jake. Some important developments on that. So again, there's nothing else you might add. Those, of course, are the most recent developments relating to the No Kings protests that we saw over this past weekend.
yes, certainly so. And so that leads us into our next two top stories, which are related to space. One has to do with a more somewhat recent evacuation and historic evacuation it was from the Space Center.
Absolutely, Jake. Of course, you mentioned recent evacuation from the International Space Station. Again, this happened just very recently, so not a lot of details on it yet. Well, a correction on that. This is not something that happened recently. It's something we've had some details surface recently. Again, my understanding, Jake, correct me if I'm mistaken, is that this evacuation of the International Space Station actually happened back in January. Am I correct in that assumption?
Yes, but it's just now that we're getting some of the new information detailing exactly what took place. Something else that's kind of interesting about this is the first medical evacuation that has ever taken place on the International Space Station. So, what do we know about the cause of why there was a medical evacuation?
Absolutely, Jake. Well, it's largely a mystery at this point, but in terms of what we do know, as we mentioned, of course, this was the first evacuation, again, on record with NASA, the first in 65 years of human space flight. And one of those four astronauts on this particular mission, sent to the space station by SpaceX last summer, suffered what officials described as a serious health issue prompted the four of them to hastily return, again, warranting this evacuation. Again, this one particular fellow on the mission having this medical issue. Now, as we mentioned, what it was exactly is largely a mystery at this point. Now, NASA didn't say exactly which one of them had fallen ill on January 7th or give details about what happened, citing medical privacy, but we know a bit more now about what exactly happened, again, sometime later. The particular fellow on that mission affected was by the name of Mike Fink, a 59-year-old astronaut, told the Associated Press that he was eating dinner on January 7th after preparing for a spacewalk the next day when he went into distress. Now, he couldn't walk and remembers no pain. He couldn't talk, that is, and remembers no pain. The medical episode lasted 20 minutes, and he felt fine afterward, and he still feels fine today. It was completely out of the blue. It was just amazingly quick, he said in an interview. Again, he later said, my crewmates definitely saw that I was in distress, he said, and said that all six gathered around him. It was all hands on deck within just a matter of seconds. So, again, it was very clear that Mike Fink, the astronaut here, was in distress. Again, he wasn't able to talk for a little while. We haven't received a clear explanation as of yet as to what exactly happened. Now, Fink is a retired Air Force colonel who has been to space four times. So, again, a seasoned astronaut. And again, we've never seen anything like this exactly happen before. So, it's a bit of a shock. Now, he's gone through numerous tests since returning to Earth, but doctors still don't know quite what happened. Now, they've ruled out a heart attack, and Fink said he wasn't choking, but everything else is still on the table and could be related to his several hundred days of weightlessness. So again, a problem is not abundantly clear. Again, if that was caused by being in space at the International Space Station there, again, he wasn't able to talk for a little while. That really is all we know at this point. Now, he became an astronaut back in 1996 and has logged 549 days in space for four missions, according to the Associated Press. Now, meanwhile, the International Space Station welcomed four new astronauts last month. Spacewalks and other research have been paused in their absence. Now, the information in this story, yes, again, unclear at this point as to what exactly caused it. So we will continue to follow the story of the astronaut Mike Fink, who, again, mysteriously went speechless for a little while in outer space, enough so to elicit the concern of his crewmates. But again, none of them, again, even since he's been tested here back on Earth, we don't know exactly what happened, Jake.
Wow, this is certainly just very fascinating, but also just very terrifying to think that something like this happened while he was so far away from home here, so far away from planet Earth. Certainly glad to know that he's doing well, but this certainly draws the question of does having an extended time away from Earth, does that have some health effects on the human body? Certainly something that scientists will certainly probably be researching in the days ahead. But quite a crazy story, but certainly glad to know that he is doing well back on Earth. But certainly shows that space may have effects on the human body when we're dealing with long-term visits to space that we may not know of at this point in time, with of course some saying that in the future that I've actually heard that Mars or the moon may be livable at some point, some people claiming that a whole nother society could be formed there. Well, this certainly shows that there's a lot of reasons as to why it's probably going to be quite some time until that happens. Well, in other space news, we also know that the Artemis II launch that was previously delayed back in the months of February and March is, and this is not any sort of joke or any, we're not fooling you, but it's going to be on April Fool's Day on Wednesday afternoon. Any new details on that launch that is coming in less than 48 hours, Isaac?
Well, not a lot, Jake, but as you mentioned, we do have the Artemis II space mission. It is set to launch April Fool's Day. Again, not an easy one to forget, but that is the scheduled launch date for this mission. Now, of course, this mission, as we mentioned, that's scheduled to launch at this point at 6:24 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time with a 2-hour launch window. The weather outlook during that time is about 80% favorable conditions along Florida's space coast. So, in terms of the favorable weather conditions for a space launch, again, ought to be a decent time to launch if everything goes as planned. Now, in terms of the mission, what we're looking at here, where we're going to, now this will be the first crewed mission of the Artemis program, marking the first human journey toward the moon since Apollo 17. So, we've been to the moon, of course, before. Again, it was a huge, unprecedented thing. The first time we landed on the moon. Now we're going back for a second time. So again, just the second time that we've ever done this. So again, it'll be very exciting to see that. Again, many of us, Jake, who weren't there, again, who weren't alive during the time that Apollo 17 landed on the moon. It'll be very interesting to watch the coverage of that and see how things go. Now, this is set to take 9 to 10 days, featuring a lunar flyby that is, without landing. Now, the crew includes Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, of course, being the pilot. Commander is Reed Wiseman, pilot Victor Glover, the mission specialists. Christina Cook and Jeremy Hansen, the first Canadian to leave Earth's orbit. So, again, that'll be very interesting. Of course, we haven't seen any space missions from Canada, so this will be huge. Jeremy Hansen, the first Canadian to leave Earth's orbit. Now, in terms of the objectives, what exactly they're setting out to accomplish on this particular space mission, they intend to test the Orion spacecraft's life support systems with humans aboard for the first time. So, again, very monumental there. Again, we've had these Orion spacecraft life support systems in the past, but again, they've never actually been tested with real humans on board. So, that'll be interesting. A fairly high stakes operation. Now, they also intend to validate deep space navigation, communications, and re-entry systems. So again, re-entry presumably in terms of how exactly, again, re-entry, getting back on the shuttle, getting back on the ship, and returning to Earth. Now, they also intend to serve as a a critical step here toward Artemis 3 lunar landing missions planned for 2028. So, again, another big mission they're getting ready for. So, hopefully, Artemis 2 will help them prepare for Artemis 3 coming up in 2028. Now, in terms of their preparedness, again, what they had to do to get ready leading up to this, now, NASA's resolved earlier issues, including hydrogen fuel tanks and upper stage pressurization, clearing the way for launch. So, again, these are things that we've seen issues with in the past. We've seen the launch date for Artemis 2 just being pushed back and just being postponed multiple times because, again, a number of issues with their systems. But hopefully, we've had those things resolved. So, again, they will be set to launch on April Fool's Day, though that said, again, it would not be difficult for them if things didn't work out as well. Say, April Fools, we weren't actually going to launch today. So,
Now, I
again,
will say that would be a very big inconvenience to a lot of media outlets that have already planned on designating an entire day um, to do live coverage on the event. But that would certainly be a really good way to phrase it if that did happen. They could say April Fools, but based on everything that we do know, everything went well in the dress rehearsal, so it's very likely that it will go on. But of course, it is April Fool's Day, so a few pranks could certainly happen leading up to it, but hopefully everything will go off without any sort of pranks or without um, any type of interruptions.
yes, hopefully, certainly, hopefully everything is safe, everything goes well with the Artemis 2 mission. And again, from back home, it'll be very interesting to see the coverage you were talking about just moments ago, Jake. Again, any of the folks interested in that, of course, we will continue to cover the mission here on GWP. But again, for the actual footage of the spacecraft, again, that'll be televised nationally. You can see that. Again, NASA will be providing live coverage across their platform, NASA Plus, and it will also be covered on YouTube and a number of other partner platforms. So, again, plenty of places to catch the coverage of this. And this will be, again, interesting to see. Again, because for many of us, we haven't seen anything like this. Of course, if we weren't alive at the time of Apollo 17, it'll be very interesting to see. Jake?
Yes, and so you can also find that on C-SPAN. C-SPAN's YouTube also has live coverage of that, and then you can also find it on the Weather Channel as well. I know that they're also doing some special TV coverage, as well as many of the other main media news channels and their streaming apps will also be covering it as well. I don't know exactly which ones, but I do know of those two that'll be doing that in addition to NASA's coverage.
Absolutely, yes. So again, we will continue to follow all of that. You'll want to stay tuned for all of that and much more here on GWP News Weekly. Again, often at the end of the week, we do GWP Weekly Recap as well. Again, we take a look at the things that have happened along the course of the week. It's a little bit shorter episode, but again, a great way to finish up your week. So you want to stay tuned for all of that and more. Again, we occasionally go live when many of these major breaking news events happen. But again, that about wraps things up for now. Up next is weather.
Now we go ahead and we move into weather here. Currently taking a look at your national weather alerts here across the country. We've got some red flag alerts here across the Rockies and across the Central Plains here. Some wind advisories across Oklahoma, where it's a little bit windier than it is here, although it is pretty windy here. And then we got a few winter alerts, but overall things are pretty quiet here across the U.S. as far as weather alerts go. Now, today we do have some strong winds out there, so that will lead to a little bit of a fire danger. So I understand that we've had this threat for several days now, but it's going to continue for both today and tomorrow. So fires can spread rapidly in these conditions. Outdoor burning is not recommended for today. We don't have a red flag warning, but it is still not recommended to do any outdoor burning because of the strong winds and the dry conditions that we have, especially for the areas that haven't seen a whole lot of precipitation this month. Those are the areas that we would have to be concerned about. Again, a lot of that has to do with some of the stronger winds that we are dealing with for today. This is from the National Weather Service weather story from the Springfield, Missouri office, showing that we're dealing with winds 30 to 40 miles per hour, with the highest gust along and west of 65. So again, we're looking at travel difficulties for high profile vehicles, especially. We're looking at loose objects being blown around. A few small tree limbs could come down. And then we could also be looking at some spotty power outages across the state of Missouri as a result of some of these stronger winds. So just kind of be aware of that as we go through today. We're also talking about record highs possible from Joplin, looking at a record high potentially of 85, but the record being 84 set back in 1904. And then the same thing can be said there in Springfield, Missouri as well. So unseasonably warm temperatures on top of those dry and windy conditions, that's what's leading to that fire threat that we do have. Now, the worst of the fire threat is further towards our west, where we have those red flag warnings. We've got those elevated fire concerns here across the orange, even a critical fire risk across Wyoming, where things are that much worse. This from the Storm Prediction Center's Fire Weather Outlook. This is for today, and then a little bit of a smaller area under that elevated risk as we go into tomorrow across New Mexico and Texas. So a fire threat is something we're going to be dealing with. We did mention that temperatures are going to be unseasonably warm, climbing into the 80s for today and tomorrow. So that will give us that heat risk. We're under a category 1 heat risk for both today as well as into tomorrow across the state of Missouri. Then a storm system will move in, bringing in some rain chances. That should drop our temperatures. So that category 1 heat risk is both for today and tomorrow. So those that are extremely sensitive to heat may experience some fatigue and some issues after spending some time outside. So make sure to stay hydrated and in the shade and go indoors, especially if you're feeling a little bit ill, if you've been outside for quite a bit of time. So that's going to be a risk that we're dealing with those record high temperatures for today, and possibly as well climbing into the 80s for us into tomorrow. All right, well, now let's go ahead and we'll do kind of our national view of what we've got going on. We've got some thunderstorms to the north of that ridge of high pressure. That ridge of high pressure has been what's responsible for these unseasonably warm temperatures. And so that has kept our weather dry, which has led to that fire risk. But that has kept all of the rain further towards our north, where we actually are going to be dealing with severe weather over the next couple of days. Then as we get into Tuesday night, this rain will begin to move in here as well as into the northeast here. So that's going to be something we're watching. We're also watching quite a bit of activity out west where things have been pretty dry so far this winter. So hopefully that will help us out here with any water issues that we've had across that region. The rain continues. So overall, pretty wet week here across the central U.S. with some snow further to the north. And then another system as we go into Friday and Saturday. This one will make it a lot further to the south. And so that will cool off our temperatures quite a bit as we go into the weekend, as well as you'll notice kind of this trough beginning to develop, these colder temperatures moving in from the northern plains. Not necessarily cold, but definitely chillier in comparison to where we're at in the early part of this week. So that's an overall picture of what we're going to be experiencing. Now we're going to break it down by region. We're going to start in the western half of the country here, where we're going to be experiencing some rain and snow here across the Pacific Northwest. So that's something that we're going to be dealing with. Then as we go into Wednesday, you'll notice that that continues to move in, now getting into California as we go into your Wednesday. And then this will begin to move east, but another storm system will move in across the Pacific Northwest. So again, all of this is much needed rain and snowfall that we're going to be experiencing day after day here. And then as we go into Friday, additional snow chances. This is something we need to watch here, because we're going to be dealing with some strong winds and some heavy amounts of snow. So we could actually be looking at blizzard conditions as we go into Thursday and Friday here across the Rockies and northern plains. So if you're going to be traveling across that region, definitely be aware of that. But by the weekend, everything should dry out west. But again, all of this is much needed snowfall. Looking at that snowfall forecast, the Sierras getting in on some snowfall, the Rockies as well as into the Cascades, some much needed snowfall across this region, potentially adding up to a couple of feet of snow in the higher elevations. In the lower elevations, we could be looking at some heavy amounts of rainfall, with some areas picking up close to 2 inches of rainfall throughout the week. So again, as we mentioned, we are down quite a bit as far as snowfall goes. You see this blue area. This is where we should be. Okay. This is where we were last year in this kind of tan color. And then this black line is where we're at right now. And so you'll notice that we did have some snow earlier in the winter back in February. That got us close to average, but we never really got anywhere near average. And you'll notice that we are well below where we should be for this time of the year. This is usually when we have, the biggest Sierra snowpack. This is usually when we have the most snow on the ground in the Sierras because it builds up throughout the winter and it usually doesn't start melting until late April. But we've seen some early season melting, and so we're well below average on our snowpack. And so this is what our concern is. Right now, we are at 22% of our normal snowpack in the Sierras. This is a really big concern because this is where this is economically really important for ski resorts, but it's also really big for drought. If we don't have a lot of snowpack, that can increase the risk for wildfire season during the summer, especially if we don't see any rain during the spring months. So that's something we're going to be watching. And then the other concern is water. The Sierra Snowpack is where we get a lot of our water source here across the state of California. You'll notice what it says. 30% of California's fresh water is supplied by this Sierra snowpack. So again, we are well below average on where we should be. So this is something that is a pretty big concern here out west, but hopefully some of that precipitation that we get this week will help out things. All right, now we move into the north central region, again with some storms staying further to our north for today and tomorrow, but then tomorrow night into Wednesday, heavier amounts of rainfall expected here across the state of Missouri. To our north, we're going to be dealing with some snow and ice. So if you're traveling across this area, this is going to be a pretty big concern as we could be dealing with some ice accretion across central Wisconsin, northern Minnesota, and northern Iowa. This is going into Thursday morning. Heavy rain and thunderstorms continue into Thursday night. We get a brief break on Friday before on Saturday, additional chances for rain with much cooler temperatures move in here across the state of Missouri. So we do have a severe weather risk here across just to the north of us, across Iowa, Wisconsin, and Illinois for today. So that is going to be a concern. Winds and hail are going to be our main risk with that 2 inch or greater hail possible across that hatched area from Iowa into Michigan. The severe weather threat continues and tomorrow across the Great Lakes. This is typically not where we would see severe weather during this time of the year. Typically, we don't see severe weather in this area until May or June. So certainly quite a bit early. Then we have another area for severe risk across Texas and Oklahoma, but you'll notice we do have thunderstorms Tuesday night, but luckily we're not under that severe risk. So this is your day 3 severe weather outlook from the Storm Prediction Center. Now this shows that part of western Missouri will be involved in that severe weather risk. So potential severe storms on Wednesday here in the state of Missouri. So that's something we're going to have to watch. But overall, our severe weather threat is going to be pretty low, and the majority of the severe storms are going to be west of Interstate 49, but this is something that we're going to be watching for Wednesday and Wednesday night across the region. So we already showed you that. How much snowfall? So of course we talked about how there would be snowfall on the northern side of this. We could be looking at over a foot of snowfall across Wisconsin and Michigan with some lighter totals across Nebraska and Iowa expected on the backside of the storm system. As far as rainfall goes, we are going to be looking at quite a bit of rainfall. Western Missouri, we could be looking at anywhere from 2 to 5 inches of rainfall. Across central and eastern Missouri, around 1 to 3 inches of rainfall is expected. So several inches of much needed rainfall is expected here across the state of Missouri. And so that is why we're under the Weather Prediction Center's flood outlook for Wednesday. So this is your Wednesday flood outlook. We're under a marginal flood risk. We're also under a marginal flood risk for Thursday. And then central and eastern Missouri is also under that flood risk as we go into Friday. So we could be looking at some flooding with some of the heavy amounts of rainfall here across the center of the country. What about across the Northeast here? We've been pretty active across this region. Tuesday into Wednesday, thunderstorms expected with heavy amounts of rainfall. Again, even that severe risk here across the Great Lakes is expected. On the northern side of this, we do have some snow and ice across the state of Maine as we go into Tuesday and Wednesday. And then once again, as we go into Friday with another round of rain, snow, and ice expected here across Maine. The majority of the wintry weather will be mainly here across the state of Maine, where we could be looking at some pretty impressive ice totals and some snowfall totals across this region, but the majority of the Northeast will stay all rain, with precipitation amounts anywhere from about 2 to 5 inches of rain expected across this area, so some flooding is going to be possible. Of course, we've been talking about how a lot of areas are very dry right now, which has led to that fire risk. Here is a look at the U.S. Drought Monitor. The worst of the drought here across the southern portion of the U.S., the Rockies, where we just haven't had a whole lot of rain or snowfall. The Northeast and Great Lakes, it's been a very wet winter and snowy winter across this region, so we're doing pretty good. Here in the state of Missouri, we did have a bit of a drought earlier this winter. That is starting to back off a little bit with some of the rainfall that we had earlier during the month of March, and that will continue to do so with the rainfall that we're expecting into the early part of April. All right, where are temperatures going to be at through all of this? Well, they're going to be pretty warm today and tomorrow, as we mentioned. Then into Wednesday and Thursday, a bit of a cool down, but we're still going to be staying above average. Then as we go into this weekend, much colder temperatures are expected. Again, it's not necessarily going to be cold, it's just going to be colder compared to where we're at right now. And so that's what we're going to be experiencing as we go into the weekend. So Easter weekend, it's looking to be wet and likely slightly below average. And then this will continue into the early part of next week as well before the warmth returns into the 8th and 9th of April. So where does that put us from our NOAA's temperature outlooks? Now we're going to go into that long range temperature outlook, likely staying near average for our temperatures as we go from April 4th through the 8th, with temperatures staying warm to the west and to the east. Precipitation will be staying on the above average side across the eastern 2/3 of the country. Unfortunately, after this week's rain and snow, it's going to be drying out quite a bit out west. So that's something we definitely don't need. And then as we go into your 8 to 14 day temperature outlooks, this is going through April 12th. Temperatures expected to return to being above average across the state of Missouri. Precipitation will return to near average from the 6th through the 12th. So it will start off pretty active in the first week of April. And then as we go into the second week of April, precipitation will likely start to back off just a little bit. What about towards the middle and end of April? Temperatures still staying slightly above average. Precipitation will also stay slightly above average. So likely going to be a pretty wet month for us here in the month of April going ahead. As far as those hazards outlook, this is the last thing we're going to show you. State of Missouri is under that slight risk for heavy precipitation going from April 10th through the 12th. That is something that we're going to be watching. Possible flooding, river flooding, as we go into the next couple of weeks ahead with all of this heavy precipitation that we are expecting. That's it for weather. Now we move into sports.
Now, Jake, I understand we've had a number of recent sporting events. What do you have for us?
Yes, so of course we've had the ongoing NCAA Division One March Madness college basketball playoffs that have been ongoing over the weekend. We had the Elite Eight matchups where number one Michigan defeated Tennessee 95-62. Arizona also defeated Purdue 79-64. So that should set up a very big matchup in the Final Four between Michigan and Arizona Saturday night. That game is going to start at 7:49 Central Time. So that's going to be the later game. The other game was decided by the Illinois-Iowa game and the UConn-Duke matchup yesterday. The Saturday matchup between number 3 Illinois and number 9 Iowa. Illinois came up on top 71-59. And with the UConn-Duke game, that was an absolute thriller that we had. Number 2 UConn defeating the number 1 seeded Duke 73-72. UConn had the go-ahead three-pointer with 0.6 seconds left in the game. So that was absolutely a thrilling comeback for UConn there at the last second. So that puts us with an Illinois-UConn matchup in the Final Four, with, of course, the national championship game is going to be Monday night at 7:30 Central Time. And then, of course, all of the Final Four and national championship games, those are all going to be in Indianapolis. There in Indiana on Saturday, and then again on Monday, as we mentioned.
Absolutely, Jake. Yes, as you mentioned, that recent game, again, very close. Again, came down to 6 seconds. So, again, quite the game there. Again, had
Yeah,
many
so
of the folks on the
0.6
edge of their
seconds that
seats.
actually was. So
Point
even
six,
less.
0.6 seconds. Wow, that is amazing. Yes, even less. Again, 6 seconds on its own. That would be impressive, but 0.6 seconds. Wow. Talk about a close game. Well, what else do you have for us, Jake?
Yeah, so of course that's in the men's side of things. The Final Four is already locked in. On the women's side of things, the Final Four is not going to be locked in until the last couple of matchups in the Elite Eight that are going to be taking place later tonight. Actually, earlier this evening, we had Michigan and Texas that faced off. The winner of that game will be playing number one UCLA. UCLA defeated Duke 70 to 58. And then we also had UConn, which is undefeated since earlier last season. UConn won 70 to 52 against number six Notre Dame. They will face the winner of TCU in South Carolina. That game started at 8 o'clock earlier this evening. So UConn making it into the Final Four in both men's and women's March Madness, with UConn still undefeated in the women's side of things. The last time they lost was the middle of the season last year after they won the national title last year. So it's very well possible that they could be looking at two national title wins with no losses in between those back-to-back national titles. That, of course, is if they're able to win in the Final Four and championship game. So they are certainly the team to beat. As far as when those matchups will be taking place, the Final Four matchups will be on Friday, with the national championship game happening on Easter Sunday at 2:30 in the afternoon. So Good Friday is when the Final Four is going to be, and then the championship game, if you went to church services on Sunday morning, you'll be able to watch it in the afternoon, because again, it starts at 2:30 on Sunday, April 5th. That's this coming Sunday, Easter Sunday.
Absolutely. Well, stay tuned for that throughout the week. And again, you can continue to tune in to GWP News Weekly for that. We also cover that on GWP Weekly Recap, again, in a shorter form at the end of your week. So, again, a great way to start your week here with GWP News Weekly, and a great way to wrap things up as well. A little bit shorter episode to lead things off into your weekend with just bit of an overview of what happened along the course of the past week. Likewise, you can stay tuned for scoring updates on some of those events. So, again, not to fret if you miss one of the games. Again, scheduling doesn't work out, or again, you just don't get it, aren't able to access it for whatever reason. Well, you can come right here to GWP News Weekly, GWP Weekly Recap, again, for our sports segments and those scoring updates. Jake?
Yes, so make sure to stay tuned for that, of course, with the conclusion of March Madness happening within the next week. Of course, next week on Monday night, we will preview the national championship game that will be happening around the same time as our weekly news next Monday. So we'll keep you updated on that. Now, going into another college sport that is wrapping up, we've got men's college hockey. Of course, Wisconsin coming up with their second title in a row on the women's side of things. But on the men's side of things, Wisconsin won in the Woodchester Regional Final 4-3 in overtime against number three Michigan State, showing that Wisconsin very well could win on both the men's and women's side, just like what we're seeing with UConn in college basketball. And then, of course, on Saturday, we also had the Sioux Falls Regional Final, with North Dakota winning that game in a shutout 5-0 against Quinnipiac. And then we also had Denver, unranked, defeating Western Michigan in the Loveland Regional Final. That was a 6-2 finish. Denver putting up 4 points in the first period. 6-2 is the final in that game. Michigan also won, but Minnesota Duluth certainly made a comeback as they scored 3 goals in the third period. 4-3 was the final score in that game, with Michigan taking the go-ahead point or the go-ahead goal in the third period, winning that 4-3. And then as far as when the playoffs will continue in college hockey, of course, we've got the Final Four matchup this coming weekend in men's basketball. But as far as the Frozen Four for college hockey for the men's side of things, that you're going to have to wait a little bit. It's not until not this coming Thursday, but next Thursday, April 9th at 4 o'clock, we'll have Wisconsin taking on North Dakota. That game, you can catch that on ESPN2 and ESPN Plus. And then just right after that, also on ESPN2 and ESPN Plus at 7:30, we'll have Denver and Michigan in the other Frozen Four matchup, with the national championship game happening on 4:30 that following Saturday, April 11th, and that'll be on ESPN.
Absolutely. So you'll want to stay tuned for that. Again, catch the game and stay tuned here to GWP for the latest on scoring updates. Now, and I understand in terms of other recent sporting events, we got some softball scoring. What do we know from our recent games, Jake?
Yeah, so we know that Texas has remained at the top. So this is as of the latest rankings that just came out earlier today. So we know that Texas is still at the top. 31-2 is their record. Of course, they're in the Southeast Conference. Nebraska leads the Big Ten as their number two. 26-6 is their record. But then you'll notice that 5 out of the top 6 teams are from the SEC. Arkansas number 3, Alabama number 4, Tennessee number 5, and Florida number 6. We also have from the Big 12, we have number 7, Texas Tech. Also from the Southeast Conference, Georgia sitting at number 8, Oklahoma is number 9, UCLA is number 10 at this point in time. So we had a few of the bigger shakeups that took place. Of course, Georgia was number 11, so they've now risen to number 8. So that was a really big change that we had. Oklahoma State was number 25. They're now number 21. So they have risen quite a bit as well. So those were some of the bigger changes that we had in the top 25 for the Division One softball rankings. As far as Division One baseball rankings, UCLA, Texas, and Georgia Tech are still at the number 1, 2, and 3 position. Mississippi State now at number 4, but North Carolina has taken quite a jump. They went from number 13 last week to number 6, and then Oregon State did fall quite a bit after their recent losses as they dropped from, or excuse me, after their recent wins, they rose from 16 actually gone up. Oklahoma is what I meant to say has fallen as they were number 8. Now they're number 11 at this point in time. And then how about Alabama with their 22-7 record? They are now 16 after being not ranked last week. But probably the team that's taken the biggest fall in baseball is Auburn was number 5. Now they are number 18. And then Arkansas was number 4. They're now number 17. So both of those teams have taken a dramatic fall. And then teams that were previously not in the rankings include Alabama, as well as Florida, Boston College, and UCF. All of those teams were unranked at this time last week. Well, that wraps things up on sports, and so that does wrap things up for us on our weekly news.